Wargames are for everybody, young and old, and come in many forms, and as such there are lots of games with lots of different mechanics under the umbrella, often borrowing aspects from other kinds of tabletop games. This means the lines between wargame, board game and role-playing game can be very blurry at the edges, just as blurry as the line between toy, figurine and miniature. It's often more about intent and presentation than a simple set of traits. So, with all that in mind,
Attacktix was a collectible action figure game from Hasbro, launched in 2005 and conceived as a combination of miniature wargaming and trading cards.
Star Wars Attacktix battle figure game.
You're going down.
You can pick your squad, make your moves, and launch your attack. Last one standing wins. Available now where action figures are sold. Star Wars Attacktix. Starter set and 3-pack sold separately.
Attacktix wasn't a game with its own settings and characters, it used existing properties. Initially, it featured characters from Star Wars, but later expanded to include characters from Transformers and Marvel Comics. And that's not there were different versions of the game for those three properties, no. They were entirely interchangeable, so it was possible to have a team where Darth Vader and Megatron team up with Captain America. Which, now I say it out loud, makes it sound like a limited mid-2000s tabletop version of Fortnite. But it was slightly less of an IP slurry and more of just a consolidation of a few brands Hasbro had the rights to. Hell, there was even an intergalactic showdown set with both Star Wars and Transformers figures in it.
Optimus Prime? Beat Darth Vader? No way.
Find out with Attacktix. New Transformers clash with Star Wars. Pick your squad, make your moves, and launch your attack.
Which was the first crossover of those two franchises, but certainly not the last. Most of the Attacktix figures we'll be using in this video will be the Transformers ones, but that's just because we got a big box of them sent to us by a kind fellow named JPH, so thanks very much to him.
but why are we talking about Attacktix at all? Well, as we alluded to, what makes it pertinent to this channel is that it straddled the line between toys and tabletop gaming, two things that we're both into. It gave kids a taste of playing a small skirmish game but without rolling any dice or having to bust out a tape measure. How? With action features. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk a little bit about how the game actually worked. For a quick battle, you and your opponents select 3 figures each and set them up about 3 feet apart. The youngest player goes first, moving as many of their figures as they want. To move, you push the figure along and listen for the ticks made by the small wheel in the base. After all, is it really a collectible game for kids if some part of it isn't misspelled so that it can be trademarked? Each figure can move an amount of ticks equal to the number on the top of its base. Once you've moved your figures, you can attack with 2 of them. Each figure has a spring-loaded attack feature, some are melee, some are ranged. To attack, you hold onto the base of the figure and use its attack to try and knock over one of your opponent's figures. Then your opponent gets a turn, rinse and repeat. The player with the last figure standing wins. Oh, and as a small warning, Attacktix's spring-loaded projectiles are often fired with a fair bit of power, so expect to get hit with a few missiles that miss their target over the course of a game. Probably explains why a lot of the figures you find on eBay are missing their missiles. They're presumably forever lost down the back of many a mid-2000s couch.
They suggest that after a few basic games like that, you can then introduce points values. Each figure has a points value on its base, and a standard game is 100 points per side, meaning the amount of figures you actually have can vary, and there's nothing stopping you from having battles with higher points values if you've got the figures for it. Even in its basic form, Attacktix is pretty fun for what it is. You quickly start to realise that each figure is easier to knock down from certain angles and with certain weapons. So even on the completely clear play area, you have to start taking into account manoeuvring and positioning. And once you introduce points values, you're getting into list building, which gets more important once powers are added. So Attacktix could be used as a way to get a young kid, aged 6+, into wargaming, as it's already dealing with many of the same concepts. Just you're letting the ticks do the measuring and physically shooting your opponents, so it's more immediately viscerally satisfying than rolling a dice and declaring how many were hit, and doesn't involve quite as much maths. I wonder if I can weld one of these onto a dreadnought.
Also, it should be noted that if you want to appear clever, you could say that this game is simply a continuation of the work of English novelist H.G. Wells. No, seriously, stay with me here. You see, he did dabble in game design, and in 1913's Little Wars, he describes a game with toy cannons that fired little bits of dowel and physically knocked down your opponent's toy soldiers, just like Attacktix. Looking at the photos from the book, it is unmistakably a war game, and Little Wars is recognised as part of the history of wargaming. Even the toy soldiers used were about 2 inches tall, which makes them only a smidge bigger than a modern Primaris or Stormcast. So there is a fine lineage on display with Attacktix, from H.G. Wells to a game where Greedo can shoot Starscream in the dick. The other type of game, Master Battle, is pretty much the same as the Quick Battle, but with a few extra things on top. The big one is the powers. Each figure has a special power on the bottom of its base. When the figure is knocked over, that power is activated as long as this little window is showing white. It clicks around with each tick, so unless you're really good at remembering the patterns, it's basically random if the power will pop off. Oh, and there's also effects, which are basically powers, but they're always enabled, but there's very few figures that ever had one, so some versions of the rules don't even bother to print the rules for them. Like, I don't think there's a single Transformers figure that even has an effect. Also, unfortunately, since the figures have different amounts of white on the little wheel inside them, that means the Attacktix wiki was forced to have a stat listing what percentage white they are. So Mace Windu is listed as 38% white. I don't know how else you'd write that, but I kinda wish they'd found another way. Feels like I've stumbled onto the bit of the internet where people start measuring skulls.
The powers are fairly varied. Landquake here, for example, got a power that meant the ranged launchers could not attack for the rest of the turn. Dirt Boss let you put a Decepticon into play from your backups, and Darth Vader let you replace one of your troopers with Vader, effectively resurrecting him. All figures have a little symbol next to their name that specifies how good they're supposed to be, by the way. Troopers are low points cost cannon fodder figures. This all means you aren't going to be able to take advantage of certain powers unless you build a force to synergize with it. Vader's power is going to be useless unless you take some troopers, after all. You'd also get some backup figures in Master Battle, although the version of the rules we have doesn't specify how many backup figures you can have. However, the tournament rules stipulated that a 100-point team could have 50 points of backups that various powers could bring into play. And yes, tournament rules. There were tournaments. We'll get there.
One of the unique types of power the Transformers figures had was that some of them could transform. Technically, the toys themselves weren't able to physically transform, they were monoformers, if you will, but some characters had both a vehicle and robot mode figure produced, and if one of those was destroyed and their power triggered, and you had the other mode in your backups, then they could be replaced with that, which was a neat way of representing the transforming aspect the actual figures couldn't do. And speaking of the figures, let's take a closer look at them. They're made of plastic, with some parts being harder and some parts being softer. Several of the Transformers ones were released in multiple colour schemes to represent different characters, a continuation of a fine toy tradition. And between the three properties there were multiple waves of figures, with the original Star Wars getting the most with 4, and Transformers and Marvel only getting 1 apiece. Although some figures that were meant for later waves did see limited releases before the line was cancelled, and those figures can be pretty sought after by collectors now. The Transformers figures are mostly based on the designs used in the Transformers Cybertron toy line and cartoon, which is part of the Unicron trilogy of Transformers cartoons that you either grew up with and have a big fondness for, or you didn't and you likely don't. I'm the latter, although I can admit that the toys were pretty cool. However, they did do a few figures using the original 1984 designs to keep the G1ers happy.
They're actually painted pretty well for mass-produced things, and given the rough treatment they receive in the game, they're built pretty sturdy. Granted, we've had a few of them completely fall apart, but considering how old these things are getting and what you do with them, we can't be entirely surprised. They're all posable, usually with the 4 points of articulation, that being arms, waist, and head. Some of this movement can allow you to aim the spring-loaded weapons, but others are purely for show. although often they don't really look right in anything other than their default pose, or any pose, really. One thing that's less apparent here is on the Marvel and Star Wars figures is that, well, when a robot has a weird arm for a spring-loaded gimmick, you don't really think much about it. They're robots, they can be asymmetrical. But on the other lines, they can look weird. Like, really, really upsettingly weird.
I am tired of these jokes about my giant hand.
The Star Wars ones also introduced the thorny issue of needing to actually look like real people. And a few of the examples we've got really do not pull that off. Han Solo lacks the specific good looks of a young Harrison Ford and looks a lot more like Tony Hawk, and Obi-Wan looks less like Alec Guinness or Ewan McGregor and more like, well, me, but that's not a compliment to anyone involved. There were also larger battle masters, like Omega Supreme here, whose attack feature is just literally picking a whole dude up and hurling them. Others include the Star Wars LAAT that could be taken off its base to fire at opponents from a better angle, and the Jabba the Hutt one that spat balls, but upsets me on a visceral level, so we won't speak of it again. These larger figures obviously cost more to take and aren't knocked down conventionally, instead they have buttons you need to hit to take them down. With Omega, if you manage to hit both of his knees, then his legs give out and he just kinda slouches down, making the exact same expression I would if you twatted me across both my knees. Admittedly, it doesn't actually tell you how these big buggers work in the main rules, you need this separate sheet. And even then, I'm not sure if he's supposed to fall over when both knees are hit, but he's got a low centre of gravity, so he just doesn't. Maybe it was a more violent action when he was new. These Battle Masters are not to be confused with Master Battle, the Attacktix game type, Battle Masters, a later toy line that also had Transformers and Marvel characters in it, Transformers Battle Masters, small lads who turned into weapons which were introduced in the War for Cybertron Siege toy line, or, if you want an actual connection to Games Workshop in this video, the board game Battle Masters, the MB/GW collaboration from the early 90s. Hopefully this demonstrates that Hasbro are just as bad as Games Workshop for reusing names endlessly and in a way that will confuse your search engine queries to no end.
As you saw with Omega Supreme, you could buy Attacktix figures in boxed sets, but, and here the influence of trading card games finally rears its head, they also came in booster packs containing random figures. And each figure had a rarer silver-based variant you could get if you were very lucky. Although if you were hoping those silver variants would be worth enough to pay for a new conservatory now, well, I'm very sorry. For completeness, there were also some gold-based versions which came in particular box sets. There was even a box set that came with some basic terrain and rules for a capture the flag game type, but we don't have it, so we can't say much about it. Now, about those tournaments. Attacktix did have tournaments, and even officially held ones, where special all-silver variants of figures could be won. And it's fascinating to unearth conversations and videos from this era. This video of a 2006 tournament uses a Power Man 5000 song in the background, which, God, does that take me back. And looking at the old wiki in the forums, it seems like there was a small but dedicated community developing around the game. And with these tournaments being played, it meant that the game even got those official tournament rules, which helped clarify some of the things in the main rules that were a little bit vague. Also, the space you played a tournament game in was 30 by 30 inches, which is a little smaller than the 3 feet apart the basic rules state, which we found mildly interesting. Do you find it mildly interesting? Is any of this mildly interesting? Please let us know. We are so deep into this stuff now and we cannot tell. Like many games' tournament rules, one of the things they did was disallow certain units. More specifically, the big Battle Masters.
So, Omega Supreme, just like my Leviathan Dreadnought painted specifically for a 40k army, is not tournament legal. Typical. Although they possibly should have also placed some limits on how many of each character you could take, because the tournament winner in the video that we mentioned earlier took 5 Ki-Adi-Mundis, which suggests some balance issues. The question now is, what happened to Attacktix? Well, it was in production until 2007 when the brand went on hiatus, leaving a lot of announced figures unreleased. Brian Wilk, the creator of the game, stated that Hasbro were re-evaluating the presentation of Attacktix for a future relaunch that just never came. And in the coming years, I suppose its niche became filled by things like Toys to Life games such as Skylanders, Disney Infinity, Lego Dimensions, or the Starlink Battle for Azeroth, or whatever it was called. But still, it is a little sad how quickly Attacktix disappeared. Though it doesn't seem like it was ever that large, there was a community there, with people making their own custom figures, discussing tactics and rumours, such as a theorised future release of G.I. Joe themed sets and even terrain packs, which would have been cool since, although they did flirt with it, the lack of terrain is the one thing that really felt missing from the formula, and its addition would have definitely made it feel more like a proper war game, as well as adding more complexity to it. And we're not the only ones to think so, because there are, in fact, still people talking about the game 20 years after its release. And it's not uncommon to see those people using terrain in their games. Honestly, we were a little surprised to see that there was still a fairly active Attacktix Facebook group chatting about the game and showing off their truly impressive collections.
But at the end of the day, although Attacktix was fun, I can't say we're entirely surprised it didn't stick around for more than a couple of years. The mix of wargames and action figures is neat, but as people who enjoy both of those things, Attacktix doesn't quite scratch the itch of either. The figures are too much of a toy to be a miniature, but are too much of a playing piece to be an engaging toy. And the game is a fun novelty every now and again, but I can't see it appealing to many people in the long-term way that more traditional wargames do. So it sits in an awkward middle ground. Plus, the lifespans of games based on licensed properties are often shorter anyway due to the intricacies of intellectual property laws and the expensive licenses. GW's Lord of the Rings game is very much an outlier. Although we would be intrigued to know how many people this game acted as a gateway into more complex wargames for. It did teach you a lot of its concepts in a very hands-on way, and we can absolutely see someone playing this, getting a taste for the wargame stuff, and moving on to something like Warhammer, going from spring-loaded missiles to rolling dice. Although there's a good chance that robots of some type would still be involved. But regardless, this was a fascinating little rabbit hole to fall down as people who weren't into it at the time.
And now that we've covered Attacktix, we are aware we've placed ourselves one step closer to something we had hoped to avoid. One day, if we carry on down this path, we might have to, and indeed may even want to, learn how HeroClix works. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video and would like to give us positive reinforcement, then please consider giving us a like, letting us know your experience with Attacktix, if any, in the comments, or, if you'd like to see more of us, subscribing. If you're new here, we usually talk about Warhammer 40k, although if you want to hear me talk specifically about Transformers, then I have a whole other channel called Wib Does Stuff where I do just that. Oh, also thank you to Rem from 40k Theories who suggested the Simpsons giant hand joke. As soon as you mentioned it, we could not resist putting it in there. If you would like to help us make videos like this, then head over to patreon.com/snipeandwib, where, for as little as $1 a month, you'll get your name in the credits, early access to videos, and exclusive videos like a Patreon Q&A, which will be going up as soon as I've finished editing it. Also, happy Pride Month. This video wasn't written with pride in mind, but since the Transformers comics can be delightfully gay, I guess it fits. Take care, folks.